Welcome back to another episode of the Risk Podcast. Today, I'm lucky to be joined by Shilpa Arora. Shilpa is currently AML Director for EMEA at ACAMS, but prior to that, she's held various heads-off roles at Tier 1 banks, building and leading the first line of defense functions as head of governance and also as head of financial crime prevention. Shilpa, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you, Nader. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Very good, very good. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to this discussion with you.
Likewise, thank you for coming on. I mean, there's so much to discuss today. But I mean, before we jump into it, can you firstly please tell us a little bit about ACAMS?
Sure. So ACAMS is the largest international professional membership organization for anti-financial crime professionals. We support both individuals and organizations to fight financial crime. And we do this through a number of channels. So thought leadership, continuing professional education, as well as our best-in-class peer network. And when we say we're global, we are truly global. So our members, so 80,000 plus members, come from 175 countries across the world.
Amazing. Brilliant. Okay. And in terms of your career, I mean, I've given you a brief introduction there, but I've not really done it justice. So can you please share with us your career story? How did you get to this position? How did you get to where you are now?
Oh, sure. So I was born and brought up in India. I started my career as a software developer there. I moved to the UK like really early on in my still working for software firms. I then did my MBA. I moved into banking, leading large-scale technology projects and programs, then moved into business change, then moved into financial crime prevention as an opportunity arose. So I've led financial crime prevention in corporate bank in Barclays. I've also led financial crime prevention in Santander UK for the retail and business bank. And I joined ACAMS about a year plus ago now.
Okay, perfect. And thank you for not subtly correcting me there. It's ACAMS, not ACAMS, right?
Well, we'll accept any pronunciation as long as you know who we are and what we do. Yes, ACAMS, yes.
Fair enough. Okay, so you've told us how you moved into financial crime, but often the entry into this field, especially at this time, can be quite challenging. So what advice could you give people wanting to move into financial crime this year?
So it depends where you're moving from, right? Let's kind of divide into two parts. One is if you're new to the world of work, this can be quite a challenging time to be looking for your first job, basically. So if you're new to the world of work, then a number of organizations run graduate schemes, so look out for those. These are hotly contested for, and they're few and far in between, but they are offering a route into financial crime prevention type roles. There's also apprenticeships and internships, specifically a number of financial crime academies, et cetera, set up in larger organizations. So that's another route into financial crime roles if you're new to the world of work. And then there's operations roles, so be it back office KYC or screening, monitoring, etc. So there's a number of roles, and I don't mean necessarily in financial institutions. There's also a number of service providers who supply to the regulated financial services industry. So those could be good opportunities. This is where in operation roles you get exposure, you get a lot of training and support to go on to different roles. But if you are an experienced professional, then also there's a few entry points. So mostly, I think it's easier to move internally first. So if it is possible to move internally, that would be best. You can then bank on the success you've achieved in your previous roles when you're moving internally. So the routes I've seen are moves from risk and control, broader risk and control functions, moves from fraud, legal departments, from the retail network, wider business front office roles, also, change delivery, technology, etc., particularly if you've done something in financial crime prevention projects, that could be, a good route in. So that's internal. Now, if you're an experienced professional and you're moving externally, then some special programs that I've come across are things like military services programs. So, providing roles for ex-armed forces professionals. There's a lot of transferable skills there to benefit from. There's also some programs for returners from long career breaks. So these can be good entry points too, because it's a well-structured program. And another route I've seen is ex-law enforcement officers who move into financial services more broadly, but into investigation type roles or joining consultancies as well. So those are generally the sort of roles. And when you're moving in to a role, especially if there isn't the previous experience, then sort of training and education becomes all the more important, I would say, in those circumstances.
I completely agree with you, and I've seen those transitions quite often in people's CVs when we're supporting companies with hiring, and there's some great tips there. The other thing I wanted to ask you today, Shilpa, is when we're looking at the 3 lines of defense model, how effective do you think this has been in mitigating specifically financial crime related risk?
So I'm a big supporter of the 3 lines of defense model. I think the concept's very simple, but when implemented, it can be very effective in mitigating risk. And the reason I think it's so effective is because there's natural tension built into it. There's some sort of a check and challenge built into it, which is very effective for risk mitigation. And I know a number of AFC professionals sort of interpret this, the 3 lines of defense slightly differently based on the organization, the scale, the complexity, and how it works for them. But very broadly speaking, one simple way to think about it is the first line of defense. It's the place where you detect financial crime. It's the place where you deter financial crime and also investigate if something's gone wrong. And the second line of defense is where there is advice, there's guidance, there's reporting, there's entire organization. And the third line is there to challenge and to test, right? So this is broadly sort of the 3 lines of defense. And the strength of this model is because it splits the doing. The doing part is more in the first line, from the thinking, which is in the second line, the translation of policies, translation of regulations into policies and procedures and so on. And then the testing, which is in the third line, to make sure that controls are working as they should in the second line as well as in the first line. So that's sort of the strength of the model. And of course, everything I've kind of said now is for large organizations, and it makes sense. If it's a fintech, and particularly if it's like a startup fintech, there aren't sort of that many people as such to start off with. So some of these kind of roles might overlap from each other. Of course, testing has to be independent. That cannot overlap, but the other roles often tend to. Or things are in the second line, which, in a more mature organization, you would expect in the first line. But then as these fintechs start to scale up and become slightly larger functions, then they're back into kind of the 3 lines of defense, because the overlap of these models, it's not sustainable as the scale and complexity increases. Yeah, so those are my thoughts. As I said, big supporter. I think it can work really well when the core principles are followed.
Okay, so the original 3 lines of defense model isn't completely applicable or easy to implement in fintechs or other non-financial institutions.
I think it's applicable and I think it's implemented too, but the division isn't as clear cut as is in the larger organizations. That's where, the difference comes in. So often there is one individual or one team that's responsible for running the controls, and sometimes they run these controls on behalf of the business or the front line. as there is the expertise here, and the expertise hasn't yet built up, or literally just comes to heads. There are not that many heads to run these. But when it comes to sort of, if you're regulated fintech, I mean, fintechs come in all flavors, right? So if you're a regulated fintech, so you're looking after someone's money, then of course you have to have some basic elements of independent testing, etc. Some of the fintechs, they do it by third parties, so an external auditor, for example. But others tend to find in the longer term, it's better to build this discipline internally. So as they start to grow, then it comes back to similar things. I think the principles apply, but the practicalities of how it is on a day-to-day basis can be different. Yeah.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Thank you for that. Another thing I wanted to get your thoughts on was technology and AI. So the use of technology and AI, how is this changing the landscape of financial crime prevention?
So where do I start, Nader? I mean, change has been upon us for a few years now, right? When it comes to, AI and the tempo of AI adoption, it's sort of like increasing. I think AI is making risk mitigation possible in ways that we couldn't comprehend. It was not possible in the past. So the ability to sort of consume these large-scale multiple data points and then perform predictive analysis, this can be really beneficial when it comes to anti-financial crime controls. So if you look at these controls, so let's take KYC, for example. Okay, if you start from that part of the customer journey and start with onboarding, up until now, or maybe a few years ago, onboarding's been quite onerous on the customer. A lot of data to be supplied by the customer, but that journey is now shifting because there's so many other public sources available. Considerations of digital identity. So the reliability is improving, and the kind of that the onerous process is also reducing. So that's one aspect. Then when you go into like ongoing due diligence and regular KYC refreshes, we're moving away from periodic KYC to sort of what's referred to as perpetual KYC. So this is where when something changes, be it like an event in the customer's life or a trigger, something's happened externally, and KYC is refreshed automatically. And there's also automation when it comes to customer contacts, so confirmation can be received from the customer. So these things have made a big difference, and it's changing the controls as we knew it before. And look at screening and monitoring and the sophistication of the algorithms. We're not talking about masses of false positives anymore. That's how it used to be done in the past. These algorithms are capable of making some decisions and really focusing on what is true risk or the true positive. So that's a fantastic improvement, if you like. I think for operations risk rating as well, it's quite dynamic now. Previously, this is how it used to work. So you do risk rate at the point of onboarding, and then you risk rate at the point of periodic review. But it's no longer that's the case, so risk rating is very dynamic. So as transactions come in, as things change, it can dynamically change too. So that's very helpful. It also makes things efficient for organizations. So I think efficiency is a big thing for the organizations. So it's a fantastic improvement for financial crime professionals. The effectiveness is also a big deal. The fact that you can manage risk in ways you couldn't before. For me, the other aspect to consider for organizations stepping back from AI a little bit is many organizations find themselves in this cycle, right? There's either a fine or a sanction of some sort, or an impending fine or sanction. So a lot of investment is made into financial crime teams, and a lot of technology is, is either purchased, integrated, deployed, and so on. And as that kind of comes to an end, that interest investment sort of fizzles off, things go into BAU, the integration is not as perfect as one had hoped. And then we go back through that cycle again. So the challenge here is to really stop that sort of boom and bust investment cycle and get into mature management of BAU controls for anti-financial crime. So that would be the sort of place to get to. What does this mean for professionals in the field? So for professionals in the field, I think it's more the coming together of technology and core financial crime compliance skills. So it's no longer enough to be a technologist or an expert in financial crime prevention laws and regs. So it's bringing the both together and combining with the ability to deliver change within an organization and sustain that change within the organization. So that's the skill set that this is moving on to. So roles we're seeing are things like, tuning technologies, building these algorithms, maintaining them, data science, querying, understanding data, making sure that those risk indicators are well understood, especially when there's large swathes and volumes of data, product owners, change delivery experts. So the world is evolving from your typical advisory role up to an MLRO path into all of these different types of roles under the umbrella of financial crime prevention.
That's great. And based on what you said there, I think it's obviously fairly inevitable that the right training is going to be necessary to make sure that these functions are managed effectively, combining, like you said, the technologists with the functional financial crime professionals. They have to get the right training in place to avoid any issues further down the line.
Yeah, most definitely. I think so there's training and there's ongoing training, right? So there are some things you have to know how to do. So there is basic training required. So if you don't know how to do KYC, if you don't know how to deploy particular technologies, or you don't know the risks associated with them, then there's specific things you've got to know to be able to do the job. So there's training. But then more importantly, the challenges that you go through the organization journeys through the cycle is different. So for those different challenges, it becomes different types of training. You then need networking. You need to be able to discuss problems in a closed forum with other professionals. You need to understand how others have solved the problem and then see if you can apply some of it to your own context. So the training needs sort of changes. So by training, I don't necessarily mean, do a course, get a certification. That's important, of course. That's kind of the foundation. But beyond that keeping up with the knowledge is also really, really important.
No, that makes sense. Perfect. Okay. And now moving on to challenges in this field. So in your opinion, what are the key challenges that regulated entities are facing when it comes to financial crime prevention?
So to answer this, we're going to take a step back a little bit from financial crime prevention and look at the overall landscape. So costs are on the increase, margins are being squeezed. The cost of compliance is higher today than it was before. Customers are moving away from larger financial institutions very often into either challenger banks or embracing innovation that FinTechs are offering them. So the environment is such that there is significant cost pressure, and it's for everyone. So the FinTechs have the cost pressure of, they've got investors that they need to provide returns to. So it's all across the industry. So the key challenge here for entities is how do you achieve efficiency while yet being effective, right? The two together is quite hard. For the broader landscape, if you look at financial, we are here to prevent financial crime, but if you look at the broader landscape of how successful we've been, it's not been a fantastic success story, to be perfectly honest, because the amount of financial crime there is and the percentage of proceeds of crime that countries have managed to confiscate, it's a very small percentage. So you have to question all of this kind of controls, how effective are they being and what changes do we need to make going forward such that that effectiveness sort of increases. Also, there's a lot of focus on financial institutions, quite rightly so, and the controls are improving, especially larger FIs and also the other FIs too. But then you look at the other sectors. So for other sectors, we are yet to see the maturity get to similar levels for AFC controls. So if you're a regulated entity and you're not financial services, then getting those mature controls is where the key challenges will be for the next few years.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Makes sense. Okay, so my next question is, how is the culture of AML evolving in these regulated entities?
So there's a lot of definitions for culture. So it's how do you view culture in this context, right? So
That's a good point.
Yeah. So maybe we look at culture, two aspects of culture. So there's positive intent. So we want to do the right thing being one of them, and effective controls being the other. Then culture change starts with awareness. So if you look at the awareness, and I think awareness is higher today than it's ever been before. There's a lot of awareness of financial crime prevention in financial services. There's also, I would say, acceptance and commitment, and to the extent, intent to comply too. In terms of progress, you could go so far as saying most financial services, they've got some controls, they operate these controls, they've got budgets they allocate towards it, they're trying to fight financial crime, they're attempting to comply. But again, when you look at other regulated entities, and FATF calls this DNFBB, so designated non-finance businesses and professions. So these could be your lawyers, your accountants, real estate, high-value dealers. We've not yet seen the results of the reg exams in large extent in these industries. And as we start seeing it, we will understand a bit more about, where culture sits in terms of these industries. And irrespective of industry, now, if you take a step back and look at, one definition of culture, and this is not my definition, somebody else very clever came up with it, is it's what you do when nobody is looking, right? So now, if you say you take away the regulatory scrutiny, you take away the pressure that's putting in on organizations, and you remove all the big sanctions and the big fines for wrongdoing, etc., will the same motivation and the same commitment remain? That's the question to be asked. And as we all know this, I think it's very hard to say that it will. So that's kind of, the key question with respect to culture. Also a short plug here. So ACAMS, in partnership with Oliver Wyman, is doing a white paper on AML culture. So we did a survey earlier in the year, and we're writing a white paper on how AML culture is evolving. So that will be published in a couple of months. So I won't give away too much here, but watch the space for more to come.
Amazing. Well, I'll try and get it out of you offline afterwards anyway, because I want to learn more about that.
Fantastic.
Now that sounds great. And I do love that definition of culture as well. I completely agree with that. It is what you do when people are not looking. The other thing I wanted to get from you is advice that we can give to the listeners and our audience on how to keep up with changes in the industry. The industry is ever evolving, whether it's regulatory or technology trends. So what advice could you give, whether it be training programs or just material people can engage in?
Sure. So first of all, you've got to acknowledge, as you've said, Nader, that the pace of change is significant in our industry, right? So keeping up with the latest is quite important. And the reason it's so important is often if you don't, you end up trying to solve problems in your own way. When you start to talk to others, see what else is out there and what's going on, you come up with better solutions by talking to other professionals. So it's very important to kind of keep up with what's going on and to find out how others are solving problems as well. Now, how do you do this? I think how you do this will depend upon how you consume information best. So for me, I consume information by reading and talking to people. So I would read something and then I'd reach out to someone in my network who's either working in that area or doing a project or in the throes of implementation in that area and bounce off things with them. And that helps me kind of consolidate and keep up with what's going on. There's many different sources of information, so, following specific organizations on social media, that's quite useful. So organizations like FATF, which are standard setting body, or your local regulators who put out guidance papers and so on. So that's quite useful. Following organizations like ACAMS, you do a lot of posts, etc. So it'll help you keep up with what's going on. Our enterprise members also have access to our journalistic arm called moneylaundering.com. So they tell us that they found that very useful because it's got all the enforcement actions all around the world on it. And there's also opinion pieces and interviews, etc., which makes for, easy reading to keep up. So that's one avenue. And also, podcasts like what we are doing now. So that's another avenue, isn't it? So especially if you want to listen and you don't have to necessarily stay at the desk in order to do so, that gives a good avenue too. And other things. So if many people tell me, oh, we're too busy, we're so busy, we don't have time for this, right? So there are ways such as like webinars, you can do one at your lunch hour or beginning of the day, end of the day. Taking, if you're busy on a day to do it daily, taking time out to attend a conference, for example, like, you devote a day or 2 days every so often to kind of engage with the community. This can be quite powerful because it brings together, individuals from so many different organizations. So you get to hear what's going on really and truly through those mechanisms. So those could be also networking meetings. And I know through Zoom, it's a lot harder than it's been face to face. But, those breakfast meetings, those lunch meetings, etc., they can be quite good for networking, as well as understanding, getting a pulse on what's going on and who's doing what, etc. So that's quite good. And finally, I'd like to say keeping up takes time and effort. Like, it doesn't happen just automatically. So you got to make it happen. And the best recommendation for those who are kind of struggling to say, well, how do I do this, is you got to make some time for it. However small that unit of time is, it could be 5 minutes a day or 10 minutes a day. But once you get into the rhythm of reading, understanding what's going on, and before you know it, it's challenging, it's interesting, it's exciting. It can be quite a lot of fun. So it isn't so hard to do it anymore. It becomes part of your daily rhythm, really. So that's my advice.
That's brilliant. No, thank you for that. I'm looking forward to the next conference in person. Obviously, COVID restrictions permitting, but I do miss that interaction. And I've learned a lot from conferences I've attended in the past, even if it's relationships that, we kind of get into later down the line. But no, that's definitely, there's a few good tips there.
Virtual conferences are doing well too. Virtual conferences are doing well too, so that's another way. I mean, it's not the same as being face to face with someone, but there are networking rooms, etc., available in some of these conferences. So rather than doing no networking, it's better to attend that, which would give you, a good feel to what's going on too. Definitely.
That's true. And there's no commute attached to that. You can just log on.
Yes, there are some advantages. It also makes it accessible to attend conferences that are happening in the other parts of the world, whereas previously you had to fly out to do that. So it was a lot more difficult. So it's got some advantages, definitely.
Okay. No. All right. So today, as we record this, it's International Women's Day. So I wanted to get your thoughts on gender diversity in financial crime prevention field.
Yeah, so let's kind of start off with the positives. First of all, we have come such a long way since that first march in 1908, where 15,000 women marched in New York City demanding voting rights and better pay, right? So the challenges are quite different now. I think it's fair to say women play a big role in society beyond the traditional homemaker roles that we saw in that time. Also, a number of organizations have committed so much to make changes at all levels. And I think for the modern workforce, diversity is an expectation. It's a growing expectation of our current workplace. also an expectation of generations younger than us. So they expect a fair working environment. Then things like gender pay gap reports, etc., they've made the environment a lot more transparent. So those issues around pay, etc., are well recognized, well known. So that helps too. So another way of looking at it is we've moved on from those types of challenges to more complex challenges now. And those challenges are, how do you get more women in senior roles? How do you get more women in technology, more women in financial services? How do we build confidence in women? How do you ensure that leaders and managers are giving equal weightage to skills and experience, not just being swayed by bravado or confidence or arrogance? That's quite important too. I think compliance as a field perhaps does quite well when it comes to gender diversity, but compliance doesn't work in isolation. It is part of the financial services industry, the technology industry, and we know that these industries do struggle with, equal representation of women in senior roles when compared to, say, education, for example. There's definitely a gap there. And what helps, things like, role models, right? So the greater number of role models there are, the greater number of senior women there are in these types of industries, the further the opportunities are to put down some of these types of barriers. I think also a big believer of the mentoring systems, particularly where mentors then go on to sponsor their mentees. That can be very successful. Also providing leadership opportunities to women through specific projects, etc. So that can be quite helpful. These are all the sort of tangible things that many organizations in the industries we work in are doing to make a change. But there's still a lot to do, right? It's not, it's sort of, how do you say this? So I read a recent article in The Economist which linked poverty to inequality and gender bias. And it was a very stark reminder of how far there is still to go. And equality itself is not equal in all parts of the world. Equality itself is unequal based on where you are. So from my perspective, I see that we are doing a lot, but there is a lot more to do. It's a long journey. Onwards and upwards, I would say, as there is so much more to do.
Yeah, there's lots to do, but it seems like it's moving in the right direction. And as long as there's progress every day, then it will continue to do so.
Absolutely. Sometimes the progress can feel agonizingly slow, but I would by and large tend to agree that there is some progress, most definitely.
Brilliant. That's great. Shilpa, thank you so much for your time today. You gave us some great, unique insights, lots of learnings and lots of take-home points to our financial crime network. So thanks again for joining us. Thank you for your views.
It's my pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you, and I do hope the listeners find the conversation useful. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Nader, and you're doing a great job in bringing so many different diverse experts to provide their views. So well done to you too.
Thank you very much. And if anyone does have any questions or any follow-up thoughts to share with Shilpa, please do directly message me, and hopefully we can get those answered. Thanks again, Shilpa, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.